Good evening, everyone. My name is Elliot Davis, and I'm really thrilled to be your director at the Norton Museum of Art, and even more thrilled to be introducing our distinguished speaker this evening, Paul Goldberger, contributing editor at Vanity Fair and in the Huffington Post, has been called, quote, the leading figure in architectural criticism. From 1997 to 2011, Paul has served as the architectural critic for The New Yorker, where he wrote the magazine's celebrated Skyline column. He began his career at the New York Times, where his 1984 architecture criticism, he wrote, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Distinguished Criticism, the highest award in journalism. He also holds the Joseph Urban Chair in Design and Architecture at the New School in New York City. He was formerly dean of the Parsons School of Design. He's the author of many books. I hope you've had a chance to dip into them. Recently, Ballpark, Baseball in the American City, but also Building Art, The Life and Work of Frank Gehry, Why Architecture Matters, 2009, Building Up and Tearing Down, Reflections on the Age of Architecture, and Christo and Jean-Claude from 2010. He lectures widely on architecture, design, historic preservation, and cities. He's taught at the Yale School of Architecture and the Graduate School of Journalism at the University of California, Berkeley, in addition to the New School. His writings have received numerous awards in addition to the Pulitzer, including the President's Medal of the Municipal Art Society of New York and the Medal of the American Institute of Architects. He also received the honor of the New York Landmarks Preservation Foundation in recognition of what the foundation has called, quote, the nation's most balanced, penetrating, and poetic analyses of architecture and design. Other awards include the Vince Scully Prize for the National Building Museum in 2012, American Academy of Arts and Letters Architecture Award in 2017, and 6 honorary doctorates. You must have quite a load when you get all those hoods together, Paul. Paul has dedicated time as well as a special consultant and advisor on architecture and planning matters to the Morgan Library, Corcoran Gallery in Washington, Carnegie in Pittsburgh, the Carnegie Science Center, the New York Public Library, as well as Cornell and Harvard universities. We are thrilled to extend a warm welcome to Paul Goldberger and welcome him to the stage of the Stiller Auditorium at the Norton Museum of Art. Thank you so much. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you so much, Elliot. It's a great pleasure to be back here. All the more, I think, because of this new building. I'm really glad that the museum asked me to say a word about this building tonight and chose my topic for me, but it's a good one. And it's actually a special pleasure for me to think about museums right now, if only because so much of my time in the last few years has been spent devoted to a building type that would seem to be its exact opposite, the baseball park. As the director just told you, my most recent book is a study of baseball parks, not just as architecture, but also as public space. And it sets out my view that ballparks since the middle of the 19th century have been one of the most important but least understood types of public space in American cities, and that the histories of baseball and the history of American cities are deeply intertwined. In fact, the most exciting discovery for me was in just seeing how baseball pretty much reflects what we think of our cities and how we've treated them over the last 150 years. The ballpark isn't about just baseball, but about the idea of common space and what we've understood it to be at different times in our history. So in any event, when I was getting ready for tonight, I thought how refreshing to finally be thinking about something different. That is, until I realized I'm not entirely sure it is so very different after all. Indeed, if the ballpark is not just about baseball, but about the ways in which we seek public space and express the pleasure of and the meaning of coming together, in a physical space designed for a particular purpose that we all, for a particular period of time, share, which is to say the playing of and watching of a baseball game, the art museum is ever more in our time also a form of public space. Like the ballpark, a place where people come together in a physical space designed for a particular purpose, and that its occupants, for a defined and special period of time, share. In this case, of course, it's the experience of looking at art, not the experience of watching a game being played. Now, obviously, looking at art is a more personal experience than watching a game with thousands of other fans. Let's put aside for the moment the fact that there are days when the Museum of Modern Art feels as crowded, if not quite as loud, as a baseball stadium. We all know that, of course, art is not baseball. Baseball is not art. And watching an event that unfolds over time is very different from one's own experience of navigating around and through an art museum. Everyone knows these aren't the same, and I'm not trying to equate them. My point is a different one. I'll come back to this in a few minutes, but what's defined the art museum most in our time is that it is a public, not a private experience, with all that the notion of public experience implies. It wasn't always so. When the Norton was built in 1941, like so many American museums, it was intended as a civic monument and as a notable piece of public architecture. But the point of its monumentality was not so much to make a public gathering place as to enhance the stature of the art within it, to give it gravitas, we might say. We could give this a slight twist and observe that museums are objects of status, confirmations of status. It's surely no accident that in virtually every major city in America, the late 19th or early 20th century museum was placed away from the centers of commerce, often on a great boulevard or park, invariably toward the section of town where the rich people lived. No better example than Fifth Avenue in New York for the Met, which also managed to be in Central Park, thus achieving both the presence of being in a park and along a boulevard of the well-to-do at the same time. Or out Huntington Avenue in Back Bay for the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, within Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, out Main Street in Houston for the Houston Museum of Fine Arts, which we see here, at the beginning of Fairmount Park and the head of Benjamin Franklin Parkway in Philadelphia, out Euclid Avenue in Cleveland, Forest Park in St. Louis, or along the Intercoastal Waterway here in West Palm Beach. Now, we no longer quite do that way. For the last generation, when we built new museums or relocated old ones, they've tended to be downtown, like the new Seattle Art Museum, which actually moved out of a park toward downtown, or the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco, or both the Broad and the Museum of Contemporary Art in downtown Los Angeles. But if we go back 100 years, it was very different. Museums were built to give physical form to the notion that art ennobles, or at least proximity to art ennobles. So it was believed, and so it was felt important that in big cities, the art museum be kept away from downtown, as if not to sully art with too obvious a connection to the commerce that actually paid for it. Thus, the museum was where I've just shown you, with only one exception that I can think of, the Art Institute of Chicago, in Grant Park, to be sure, but also along Michigan Avenue in the heart of the commercial district. Now, all of these buildings were, in a sense, palaces of art. To some extent, they were presented as palaces for the people, yet they took care not to be too populist, not to be too much of a people's palace. I suspect that few of the industrialists and civic leaders whose fortunes and ambitions were behind the creation of major American museums wanted to see vast crowds surging through the museum, pushing and shoving and jostling for position. And they certainly did not imagine the museums as commercial centers, as virtual shopping malls, as some of them have become. They presumed the crowds were mainly out of doors on the street, where monumental architecture would lead them to admire the power and vision of the founders. The art within was protected, private, a mystical source of uplift to be shared by relatively few. Perhaps temple is a better word then than palace, for the message many of our early museums conveyed was often that art was possessed not by its makers or by its viewers, but by its patrons. And they kept it on a pedestal, unsoiled and apart, perhaps as much to emphasize their own status as that of the art itself. Now, if I paint a picture of the early art museum as an elitist institution, its elitism was born of innocence more than venality. I suspect many of the founders of the great art museums of this country truly believed that they were protecting the nobility of art by making the museum a temple as much as a palace. They believed in the power of art to uplift, although, of course, for many of the founders of art museums, the thing they most wanted the art to lift up was their own reputations. Today, I think we are far more sensitive to that than we once were, maybe even too much so, given how much fire many museums have come under in recent years for having accepted gifts from donors with less than stellar reputations, or whose money was earned by doing things that may not have been to society's benefit. Not to make light of this, but if the Metropolitan Museum had applied such a standard when it was founded in the age of the 19th century robber barons, it would never have gotten off the ground. The critic Lee Rosenbaum, who writes the Culture Girl blog, wrote recently that the so-called effort to, quote, decolonize museums and force many donors off their boards was more of an effort to demonize museums, and that museums were the wrong target. It's easier, she wrote, and I quote, to parade around chanting slogans in the museum's public-friendly spaces than it is to go after the private companies that are committing the alleged offenses. Now, that's not to say that all money is acceptable or that museums should not vet the sources of their gifts carefully. But I'm very struck by the acuteness of her observation that it is the very, quote, public-friendly nature of museums that has made them political targets. It's because they become public spaces for us in a new way, a way that has little direct connection to art, that makes them work as venues for this kind of public protest, and ironically makes the very institution that creates open space become a target. It's not dissimilar to the ways in which universities are sometimes targeted for their investments. Now, we've drifted a little far from architecture in this little history, so let me get back to it. So what about the buildings? What of the palaces, the temples themselves? Well, at the beginning, they really were palaces, from the Gothic revival beginnings of the American Museum in the 19th century to the grandiose classical structures of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Great Beaux-Arts buildings we've just been looking at, like the Metropolitan and so many others, culminating perhaps in John Russell Pope's great National Gallery in Washington of 1941, amazingly the same year that the original Norton opened, a building that I increasingly think is among the great museum structures of any era. It took the construction in 1978 of I.M. Pei's East Building to make me realize how great the original Pope building was, but that's another story for another time. Suffice it to say that this proves that architectural and civic grandeur need be no obstacle to the respectful and deferential display of works of art. Now, that's a pretty long wind-up, given that what I really wanted to talk about tonight is not the museums of a past generation, but the museums of our own. for this has been a time for museums like none other. The role of the museum hasn't changed entirely. It's still a child of conflicting goals, born out of a desire to protect and study art on the one hand, and out of a desire to proclaim cultural and economic legitimacy, not to mention to bask in art's reflected glory, on the other. It's not enough for a city today to be big and prosperous to prove that it's world class. It takes not just any museum, but a major one, a substantial one, to confirm that status. Increasingly in our time, museums are defined as serious institutions by the extent to which they express themselves architecturally. Indeed, it's hard not to think that sometimes it's the museum building that's the prime object in a museum's collection, not the paintings or sculpture. That was actually quite literally the case a generation ago in Atlanta when the High Museum of Art, lacking a major collection, decided to put itself on the map by commissioning Richard Meyer to design this building, a building that the trustees hoped would itself act to raise the profile of the institution and attract the art it sought. So too in Milwaukee, where I apologize I don't have a picture, where in 2001, Santiago Calatrava's expansion was completed with a spectacular atrium that became a virtual symbol of Milwaukee, but not much in the way of new gallery space. While not many institutions have been quite so blunt about it as this, the trend toward using architecture as a lure for the public has continued unabated. By now, the list is well known, and we don't need to go through all of it here. Everybody knows Frank Gehry's extraordinary Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain, just as of 1997, just as many know Richard Meyer's Getty in Los Angeles, Herzog and de Meuron's Tate Modern in London, a conversion of the old Bankside power station completed in 2000. And, by the way, since we're in a Norman Foster building, I should point out Foster's Millennium Bridge on the left side of that image, and Renzo Piano's magnificent Menil collection in Houston of 1987, Piano's modern wing of the Art Institute of Chicago, his Byler in Basel, Daniel Liebeskin's Denver Art Museum of 2006, more recently, the Broad, which I already showed you, in Los Angeles, and Herzog and de Meuron's Perez Art Museum just down the road in Miami. And we could go on, because the list is long, and my point is not to turn this talk into a survey course on contemporary museum architecture, but to think a bit about what common themes there might be in what they say. In each of these cases, the choice of the architect has been a deliberate attempt to make a particular kind of impact, to say to the world, this is an institution of great sophistication, an institution that can scour the world for great names and give them a chance to play in the architectural big time. Some of these buildings are quite successful, others don't work as well. My point right now, and I'll get in a moment to the rest, is to underscore how intimate the connections have become between museums and architectural status. For several decades now, the museum has been the prestige commission. Now, is anything really wrong with that? Not in and of itself. There's certainly nothing inherently wrong about the museum as a conspicuous architectural presence. Museums are significant foreground objects in our cities and have been so for a long time, and they're crucial parts of the larger architectural mission in American cities, which is the search to establish a sense of place. The increasingly difficult, urgent, and almost desperate push to make every place not exactly like every other place. They'd certainly do better than airports at that particular challenge. For this reason, the museum is one of the few buildings in our present system of architectural values that we expect to be large, separate, and distinct, even when it's located downtown. It doesn't need to blend in quite the same way. Once again, Frank Gehry's museum in Bilbao, Spain, is perhaps the most successful example of that. It's set right in the heart of this old industrial city, on the riverfront, visible from all over the city. It takes what had been a deteriorated industrial riverfront and turns it into the new heart of the city. The vistas of his building, which is something like an abstract version of a rose or an artichoke with petals of titanium rising out of a limestone base, are spectacular when you see them from down one of Bilbao's long streets, or, as in the prior slide, when viewed from across the river with the whole city as a backdrop. It's a building that brilliantly energizes an old city while respecting its physical form. But at the same time, we could look at an architect as different from Gehry as Norman Foster, who's made a whole subspecialty of his practice, the design of new museums that add on to old ones, familiar to those of you here, of course, in a way that looks dramatically different from the original, but which take many of their architectural cues from the older structures and engage in a gentle dance of respectful opposites. The original structure represents solidity and weight and opacity, to which Foster responds usually with lightness and transparency, but all of it responsive to the scale and layout of the original. In almost every case, Foster dances by letting the original building lead. We see that here in the Sackler Gallery of the Royal Academy of Art in London, at the Museum of Fine Art, the Carré d'Art in Nîmes, France, and of course in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and of course right here at the Norton. Here, Foster has also added lightness, turning the Norton from a somewhat formal treasure box into a series of lighter pavilions oriented toward public space and the landscape. The new entrance does what Foster has done elsewhere, which is to show that an unambiguously modern structure can coexist comfortably with an older one, and that the two can enter into a mutually respectful architectural dialogue. In this case, the openness of the new mitigates against what I found to be the least appealing, or at least the most outdated, aspect of the original Norton building, which is the sense that it was a closed box. A jewel box, to be sure, but a closed one whose very nature seemed intended to remind us that it was a private treasure house. Now, for a long time, I thought you could divide contemporary museums into those that were architecturally assertive, let's say the spiritual descendants of Frank Lloyd Wright's great Guggenheim Museum in New York of 1959 on the left, and those that sought more neutrality, like Philip Goodwin and Edward Durrell Stone's original Museum of Modern Art, also in New York of 1939, expanded many, many times by multiple architects. I'll come back to MoMA in a couple of minutes. But you could create a theory that the Wright building was primarily a tour de force, in which the architect's ideas, very sculptural, seemed to take precedence over the way in which painting was displayed. That's what a lot of people said. Whereas the Museum of Modern Art was more modest, more restrained, less an attraction in itself than a neutral container for paintings. In many ways, this duality kind of reflected two different views of what modern architecture was: stark and simple, or a new form of Baroque, richly expressed form and space. After all, you could see it in things like airports. Eero Saarinen's TWA terminal at Kennedy on the top, the Atlanta Hartsfield Airport, an earlier version of it, on the bottom. Now that dichotomy, plain versus highly expressive, ruled much commentary on the architecture of museums for a long time. But I'm not sure it was ever truly right. First, it proposes that highly dramatic Guggenheim invariably overshadowed the art within it. And that's not always true. Yes, it's assertive, and nobody who enters it fails to think about Frank Lloyd Wright's mind-blowing space. But it works brilliantly for many kinds of art that it doesn't fight with at all. And sometimes, as in the case of great color field abstraction, it offers an experience that's richer than almost any other museum could. I remember many years ago being at a Calder retrospective where you could stand on one side of the rotunda and look across to see 4 floors of Calders, all together in the background, and a huge mobile hanging in the center. It was incredibly exciting, and it could not have happened in any other museum. Frank Gehry has said many times that he wants his architecture to inspire artists, to encourage them to engage in a kind of dialogue with him. He feels this is much better than architecture that lies down and plays dead in front of art. I think he's right up to a point. It works if you are one of the two Franks, Wright or Gehry. On the other hand, if you are Daniel Libeskind in Denver, sad to say, the architecture is assertive in a way that gets in the way of art and doesn't provide a trade-off, a compensatory benefit, as it does with either of the two Guggenheims, or with the beautiful museums by Herzog and de Meuron, or the Menil by Piano, or if I can mention two of the most important precedents from a slightly earlier generation, Louis Kahn's sublime Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth and his Yale Center for British Art in New Haven. All of these are strong, powerful works of architecture and subtly deferential at the same time. I wish I could say the same for the Libeskind, where the shape doesn't give you a profound architectural experience. It mainly means you can't hang any pictures on the wall. Or Moshe Safdie's Crystal Bridges Museum in Bentonville, Arkansas, which, like the Libeskind, is architectural showmanship that does not engage in meaningful dialogue with art. It's a flamboyant design into which art is put, which is different. Any visual dramatic building can be a magnet to attract visitors, but that doesn't make it architecture that actually engages with art and impacts in a meaningful way how you see it and how you think about it. So the first thing wrong with the old way of putting contemporary museums into these two categories of assertive and non-assertive is that it ignores the huge difference between, we could call, I guess, good assertive and bad assertive, or good expressive and bad expressive, between being expressive in a way that enriches the experience of art and being expressive in a way that doesn't. But then, when you go to what many of us thought once was the opposite category, the supposedly safe harbor of the white box gallery, the neutral plain place, well, that isn't really so simple either. First, what is neutrality, really? Is there even such a thing? A big plain white space is also an aesthetic statement, sometimes as potent an aesthetic statement as anything Frank Gehry has done. Can you be truly neutral? I don't think you can. When I'm in a lot of white box spaces, including many that I like very much, I feel the presence of the white box and the concrete floor as much as the art itself. The white box is itself a very powerful thing. It only pretends to be neutral. And if you doubt my point about simple boxes being neutral, where do you put Mies van der Rohe? The enormous glass box of his National Gallery in Berlin on the left is no more a plain box than his Seagram building is a plain skyscraper. You feel the architect's presence in that Berlin building as much as you do in Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim. And beautiful as it is, it only works to display art when you erect partitions inside it, robbing the space of its essential architectural quality. Even Wright's Guggenheim has walls on which you can hang paintings. So I don't know about this whole neutral business. What I do know, and here we get to the point of this moment in our culture and how it impacts on architecture, is that the museum for better or for worse, is public space today. Culture, like higher education itself, has been democratized, and while there are certain very real compromises in this process, you see one of them in front of you, I think we still have to believe that the surge of popularity for art museums is a net gain for society. I have another theory as to what's been fueling the growth of the art museum that goes beyond the democratization of art and culture, though, and it's this. Not only are there more interested, visually eager people around, it's also the case that we now live in an age in which so many people spend so much of their time behind computer screens, dealing with virtual this and cyber that. And when you do that, and even get much of your entertainment and communication from computers and televisions and phones and so forth, you begin to cry out for the experience of authenticity. I think one reason that there's so much interest in museums today comes down to that very fact, the power of authenticity. It's the fact that what you come to the art museum to see, whether it's an illuminated manuscript or a Rembrandt drawing or a Monet, is real. When the current wave of technology made its way into our lives, there was a lot of fear that it would actually have the opposite effect, that it would destroy the power of the real, or at least blur the distinction between the virtual and the real. If you could see it all on a computer, the reasoning went, who needed to bother going to a museum? That was part of the reason that a very ambitious plan underwritten by Walter Annenberg to create an education center that would have been a kind of virtual museum at the Met never got off the ground in the 1970s. It was designed by Charles and Ray Eames, in fact. And critics complained that if you could see computerized images of works of art all the time, it would destroy the appreciation of the real. Now, of course, it's no different from what every one of us can access on our phones through the internet at every moment. And we know that the fear that computerized images of works of art would destroy an appreciation of the real was completely wrong. What happened, of course, was exactly the opposite, that the real, by being rare, became all the more precious. In the same way that seeing a Matisse in a book doesn't make you feel less eager to see the real thing, but more eager. Our experiences with computers and technology have made us crave authenticity more. We know that authenticity in our age is not something we can take for granted. We value the authentic because it is rare. The power of the real has grown, it has not diminished in our new technological environment. And another thing that's grown and not diminished, also contrary to a lot of expectations, is the value we place on real public space. Most of us spend a lot of time alone, either in office cubicles or in our cars or connected to computers, where we function as if we were alone, even if there are plenty of other people in the house or the office. And of course, everyone's heard of the predictions of the demise of public space, the end of town squares and stores and streets and malls, and indeed the obsolescence of the city itself. Who needs to be in a public place when you can do everything at home? Telecommuting would replace offices, online e-commerce would replace stores, and so forth. Well, we now know that that prediction, too, was exaggerated. Not because technology is not a very real and potent force for change, but because it ignored a fundamental aspect of human character, which is that we do not want to be alone. We need the kind of stimulation that only true public places can give us. New York City, which was supposed to be put out of business by the new technologies, is more prosperous than ever. New York has flourished recently in large part because new technology entrepreneurs themselves want to be in the city rubbing shoulders as well as communicating in cyberspace. People want to walk on streets as well as talk online. They want to be in real places. But they demand that the real places be worth their while, offering something beyond what they can get from a computer. We see that too in retail, another thing that was supposed to disappear, but which flourishes in new and adjusted guise as retail spaces reinvent themselves to create new kinds of public experience. So to return to the question of the art museum and pull all this together, if you put these two phenomena together, the increased power of authenticity and the desire to be in truly special public places, and add to this the fact of more educated people running around today, suddenly the explosion in museums is not so much of a mystery. In truth, museums have become the most important public buildings of our time. They seem to embody our culture's ideals in much the same way that cathedrals once did. Indeed, maybe it's not an exaggeration to say that museums now are the cathedrals of our time. They're certainly repositories of the past, as cathedrals are. They represent a set of shared values, as the cathedrals did when they were new. They function as community centers as well as places of enlightenment. And they're places in which, as we've already said, the wealthy often find it useful to memorialize themselves. And they are places in which the idea of immortality seems always to hover above us as we hopefully experience some degree of transcendence from daily life. Now, that's a tall order for any one building, for any one institution to fulfill. And so I think we have to ask a couple of things as we look at the 21st century museum, especially since it doesn't have behind it the one thing that empowered every cathedral, which was the commitment of an entire society, or almost a whole society, to its ideals, to the fact that it embodied a commonality of purpose that made it, in effect, a repository of the ideals and aspirations of almost everybody in the society that built it. Now, no one believes that the Museum of Modern Art or the Louvre or the Metropolitan or the Guggenheim or the Norton, beloved though they may be, embodies the beliefs of our entire society, as the cathedrals did in the Middle Ages. However wonderful our best museums are, they are not, for our age, what Chartres was for the 12th century. So maybe the comparison to a cathedral is a little flawed, because the museum doesn't represent the same kind of commonality of purpose. But nothing in our time does. So I think it's possible, in fact even necessary then, to ask what the museum does represent as public space, how good it is at giving us the public space we need, and whether, even if it is good, its qualities as public space support its original aims. That's probably a good segue back to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which, as I'm sure you know, recently reopened after yet another renovation and expansion, this one by the firm of Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro. Now, it's been a very, very long time since MoMA has truly represented the ideal that many of us carry around in our heads of this exquisite, small modern gem, where we would see some of the greatest paintings of all time in simple, mostly domestically scaled, white-painted modern rooms, and then stroll in a tranquil park-like sculpture garden. In each case, having an experience of intimate connection with works of art. MoMA has been getting bigger and bigger in stages since the early 1950s, and huge renovations in the 80s and 90s made it, in some ways, more airport and shopping mall-like with each iteration. Now, the newest version is bigger yet again, but it is better, only because it is at least somewhat more coherent, and you are less likely to get lost, and you feel more connected to the outside, to light, to the city, and so forth. I think it's demonstrably better than it was. I, too, miss the old MoMA, but we have to admit that old MoMA wasn't there before this latest renovation started. It hasn't been there for 30 or more years. And this one, even if it sometimes still feels like an airport, at least is a much better airport. I'll also say, parenthetically, that the most important thing about the newly conceived Museum of Modern Art may not be the architecture, but the curatorial decision to group painting, sculpture, architecture, design, and photography together, rather than in separate galleries, and to show it mostly chronologically. So now you really feel as if you were walking through a time, and all the resonance and power of what was created during each decade. The real thing MoMA forces us to confront, though, is the question of whether it's possible for an institution to succeed too well, to do so well at building a huge, broad-based, democratic audience that it is full of people all of the time, and the experience we all cherish of being able to contemplate a profound work of art becomes almost impossible. MoMA has built its own audience and has made itself so desirable that more and more people come all the time, requiring it to get bigger and bigger to serve the ever larger crowds that its success has engendered. I don't know what the answer to this paradox is. As I said earlier in this talk, I don't think we can or should say that it is not a good thing that more and more people want to visit art museums and have at least a whiff of the experience of authenticity as they stand before great works of Matisse or Picasso or Monet or de Kooning or Stella. We cannot and should not go back to the age when the museum was the place of exclusion more than a place of inclusion. And yet I find it hard not to think at the same time that the most important places of museum architecture today are not at the scale of the Museum of Modern Art or the Metropolitan, but smaller places like the Norton, where it is still possible to experience art in a relatively intimate way. That's why I think the most important piece of museum architecture of the last few years may be the private Glenstone Museum in Potomac, Maryland, outside of Washington, where an extraordinary collection of mostly avant-garde post-World War II art is displayed in a series of pavilions set around a water garden. Designed by Thomas Pfeiffer, it is tranquil and serene. And while the concrete building is powerful, the art is front and center. It is another instance in which art and architecture enter into a meaningful, respectful dialogue rather than shout past each other. But not the least of the factors that make Glenstone a great experience is that attendance, while open and free to all, is strictly limited as to the number of people who can be there at any one time, so that everyone will have the special experience of viewing art in an intimate and uncrowded setting. It's also a very unurban setting, surrounded by 200 acres of magnificent landscape, as much a park as an art museum. And in this sense, it takes us back to the old days of art separating itself from the bustle of the city, rather than delving right into it. I don't think the founders intended to make a deliberately anti-urban statement here, but I do think they were aware that the growing tendency to look at our cities as social places and the enormous popularity of the art museum as a place of meeting, a place of social interaction, might in some way be antithetical to the notion of the museum as a place of refuge, a place created to allow us to contemplate art at some remove from the pressures of daily life. Now, as I don't believe that a college or a university has to be set on a mountaintop to provide a proper education, I don't think the museum needs to be viewed as incompatible with our urban existence. But you do have to admit, it's a lot easier to be contemplative when you're on a rolling meadow in Potomac than on West 53rd Street in New York City, or for that matter, on the South Dixie Highway. Not the least of the pleasures of the Norton, though, is that it's on the edge of downtown West Palm Beach, convenient to the heart of the city, and yet at the same time, not immersed totally in it. It's a place of escape, and at the same time, it's now a place of sociability, far more than it was before. And that, of course, is the essence of the paradox that the museum of today presents us with. We crave its new role as public space, and we justly delight in the fact that people come to the museum not just to see art, but to see each other. In an age when so many contacts are virtual and not real, the fact that the museum makes real people want to come to be with other real people is not to be trifled with. It's a good thing. Does that mean that the experience of looking at art is not exactly the same? That the transcendent, intimate, miraculous experience of having your mind blown by a great work is not as likely to happen? I'm not quite sure of that. First, I don't think that has happened quite as constantly as we like to pretend anyway. But second, while understanding and responding to art is often intimate and personal, it is also social. And up to a point, the fact of experiencing something along with other people can enhance, not diminish, its intensity, so long as it's not as insanely exaggerated as the Mona Lisa at the Louvre. Now, it's possible I'm being too optimistic here, even naive, but I do believe that the combination of public space and greater architectural expression is a positive way to satisfy the growing demand for real, authentic experience of art in the real, material, physical world. And that this demand, far from being a bad thing, is something to celebrate. That doesn't mean that every museum that tries to make a splash is good. I've already made clear many of them are not. Or that architects always know more than curators. They do not. But they do know something about the nature of public space. And they recognize that the museum of the 21st century is more than a storehouse of art, more than a treasure house or a jewel box, built only to protect pictures. It is also a place for people to come together, to be brought together by art, a place that uses the power of art as a catalyst for social connection, a place of authentic human engagement. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm told we have time for a couple of questions. If there are any, I'm happy to. So just wait till the microphone arrives. Okay.
I know you couldn't mention every museum, but was there a reason you didn't mention the New Whitney in New York?
Was there a reason I didn't mention the New Whitney in New York? No, not really. I guess, well, I mean, when I decided to talk at a little more length about MoMA, because it's newer, I decided the New Whitney in New York is a little hard to talk about briefly because it's also, for me, a very mixed bag. I think it's, I understand all the moves that Renzo Piano was trying to do there. I don't think they're wholly successful. I also think in a way, it's the opposite of this museum here, where, as he did in Boston, one of Norman Foster's great achievements was in making everything clear and taking, by actually making it bigger, he made it more coherent, not less coherent. The Whitney is, I think, somewhat challenged in terms of circulation and moving around it. It's a little bit confusing. The best part of it, I think, is the big top floor gallery, which is a spectacular and beautiful space, but usually gets compromised when they actually start showing art in it by putting up walls, so you don't see the magnificence of it. And those outdoor sculpture decks or terraces or whatever, and the stair that connects them. That's all wonderful, and I love the fact that that's kind of counterintuitive, that instead of facing the river, which would be like the obvious thing, they're facing the other side toward the city. And the staircase, as you go down from floor to floor outside, is wonderful. On the other hand, you know, it's New York and not Palm Beach, and the times in which the weather permits you to have a pleasant outdoor experience there are fewer than they are here, I think it's fair to say, without kind of, and the circulation inside the building is actually awkward, cramped, and not always clear. So I have mixed feelings about it. I also think it's not, I understand what he was trying to do on the outside, recalling some of the industrial past of that part of Manhattan, but it's not nearly as beautiful as some of the other piano buildings. So it's mixed, my sense of it. So I said I didn't want to talk about it because it would take too long, but I just did, so there we are. All right. There.
Going back to your distinction of aggressive architecture, what might your opinion be of the Hadid Museum in Cincinnati, the Contemporary Art Center?
The Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati, good question. I would put that, I mean, if we wanted to have a little assertive scale, I would put that in the moderately assertive or moderately aggressive category. It was toned down quite a bit and compromised before they built it from her original design. Some of her later museum work, particularly like the Maxi in Rome, is in fact, for me, a little more in the Libeskind category, which is to say, assertive to the point of indifference to art. They fought a lot in Cincinnati, which was her first American building, and she was forced to make several compromises that in the end, I think actually improved the building because they made it work better for art. You know, architects, like writers need editors, architects need strong clients who sometimes push back. And you know, that's itself a long and complicated subject. But, you know, a client who says no to everything and pushes continually will drum all creative energy out of a project, and there's no point. But a client who says to an architect, do whatever you want, is rarely the best client. It's that sort of dialogue where they push and pull a little bit and encourage each other, but ultimately the client, you know, allows the architect to express his or her creative ideas, but pushes back when they feel they don't work. And they, as I said, as every honest writer will admit that a good editor makes him better. Not every architect will admit a good client makes them better, but they should because it's true.
One final question.
Sure. Okay.
First of all, I want to thank you. I thought your talk was so fascinating.
Thank you.
And I think probably everyone who's here, I mean, this is about museums and art galleries, places that we gather, and that for each of us means something very different. But I wanted to ask you, you talked about Libeskind.
Yes.
Now, I have not been to the one in the U.S.,
Right.
but I've been to the one in Berlin, which is
Right.
very similar to the one here in the United States. And I have to tell you that I disagree with you.
Okay. It's fine.
Mea culpa, but I do.
No.
Because I feel that that building, although it calls itself a museum, it's actually, I don't know if everyone here is familiar with
the Museum of Jewish Heritage in...
it's the 2,000-year history of the Jews in Germany.
Right.
And it sort of touches on the Holocaust, but it's not the focus of that museum at all. And I met Daniel Libeskind, and in that meeting, there was one thing that he told me I thought that was so stunning. He talked about the fact that he met a woman who was in Auschwitz, and on her way to Auschwitz, she was in a cattle car, and there was the door was closing in the cattle car, and there was a stream of light. In that stream of light, she felt she would live again, she would survive. After he met her, and when he built the Lieber Skin Museum in Germany, there was a hugely tall door. It must have been 50, 60 feet high.
Right.
You must be familiar with it.
Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah, and there was a shaft of light.
Mm-hmm.
There was something very meaningful for me personally. So I think that every museum has its own.
I
its
agree.
own feeling.
I agree with you, and but Berlin is a very different situation than an art museum in Denver. That's all. There in Berlin, Liebeskin's kind of sculptural inclinations, let's say, could be turned to creating a powerful emotional experience that was partly, as you say, a Holocaust memorial, which is very different from a place for the display of art. That's all. Which, in fact, it didn't function as terribly well. And the other reasons that museum works is it's technically an expansion of an older building that is an old villa that still has a lot of the art gallery space in it. So he didn't have to do that much there for that purpose. But your point that every museum is different and has a different set of needs and programs is absolutely right, just as every community is different, every situation is different. Thank you all again very much. Thank you.